My name is Stirling Miller, no relation to Dr. Ian Stirling, but I've benefited greatly from the confusion sometimes. I work for the National Wildlife Federation here in Missoula, and for the last 3 days there's been a human-bear conflicts, international human-bear conflicts workshop going on here in Missoula. And as typical in many of these conferences, we like to have an outreach session in which we reach out to members of the community with some of the experts that have participated at various levels in the conference. And so tonight, we're just very honored to have the world's foremost authority on polar bears and polar bear science, we've invited to come and give this public presentation at the end of our 3-day conference. We also are particularly want to recognize a group which has sponsored Dr. Stirling's trip here, and that's Polar Bears International. That's a international group that does polar bear education based largely in Churchill, and they facilitate research, including research done by Dr. Stirling and others. And they are based, guess where? In Bozeman. And they have brought a bunch of copies of Dr. Stirling's book here, his book that he published last year. And they are selling them at a discounted price off the retail price. So this is a good opportunity for you to get your a book, Dr. Stirling's book. It's called Polar Bears, A Natural History of a Threatened Species. And Dr. Stirling will be signing these after his presentation. Dr. Stirling is an emeritus research scientist with the Canadian Wildlife Service and an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Sciences, University of Alberta. He has done research on polar bears throughout the Canadian Arctic for 41 years, and polar bears, Arctic and Antarctic, and polar seals, Arctic and Antarctic, for 46 years. He doesn't look that. It was because of his long-term studies of polar bear populations in western Hudson Bay and the southern Beaufort Sea that it was first possible to demonstrate the negative effects of climate warming on polar bears. In a classic paper that he published with his colleague Andrew DeRoche, who is now still at the University of Alberta, that was, to my knowledge, the first paper which really demonstrated the impacts, or first really showed the pattern of the impacts for climate warming on a large charismatic species. And all the subsequent research has really validated what Dr. Stirling and Dr. DeRoche hypothesized and in that very early paper. What year was that published? 1993. For his work, he has won several awards, including the Northern Science Award, and he's been made an officer in the Order of Canada and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has authored or co-authored over 200 scientific articles and 4 books, including the one that's on sale here today. Now these Dr. Stirling's books are all highly readable. He saves his technical language for his scientific publications, and I really think that anybody will enjoy the book, and it'll be intelligible to anybody. It's really a very, very good book. And so with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Ian Stirling.
They've got me wired up. Can you hear me at the back all right? It's okay? All right, because I don't like to shout. My voice that won't last an hour. Okay, I'd first like to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear a little bit about polar bears. It's really heartwarming to see. I'd like to thank the conference very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to come here, and I see many people that I haven't seen for a long time, and that's really nice. Polar Bears International very generously agreed to sponsor me to come, and I thank the organization very much to that. And I have one other thank you I'd like to pass along, and it seems like this is the location and the venue and maybe a good time to do that. About not quite 50 years ago, Chuck Jonkel, who all you people in here in Montana know, and I were graduate students together. Now, I'd like to hasten to say that he is much, much older than me. But we got along and we talked a lot of science and things at that end. But when we both sort of finished, he went off and started working on polar bears in Hudson Bay. I went to the Antarctic and started with one of my other life interests has been ice-breeding seals. A number of years later, the Canadian Wildlife Service wanted to hire a second biologist, but to specialize on some of the relationships between polar bears and seals and sea ice and so on. And Chuck put me in touch with his boss at the time, and so to a large degree you can blame whatever you're liable to hear about on Chuck. So thanks, Charlie. I'll say this at the end of the talk as well, but very few of us do what we do and so on because we're singularly really fantastic. People open doors, people give us opportunity, people help us from time to time, and sometimes it's taken me 40 years to get around to saying this to Chuck, so it's not like I'm rushing into it, but it's important. Okay, I'm going to try and do 3 different things tonight. One is I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the biology of polar bears and their ecology, and try and give you a sense of what makes a polar bear tick and why is the sea ice so critically important to polar bears. How do they use it? How is the changes that we're seeing affect them? The second will be how is climate warming influencing the sea ice throughout the Arctic and in Hudson Bay. There's some similarities and some differences, but what's the sea ice actually doing to polar bears? And lastly, especially in the context of this particular talk, how are the changes that we're seeing and that we know are coming, what is that going to mean for human-bear conflicts down the road? So polar bears themselves, oh, got to turn that, sorry, are very large animals. Adult males stand this high on the shoulder when they're on all fours. They'll be 400 to 600 kilograms, and they live up to about 25 years or into their early 20s. Old ones get up to 20 or 25. Females are about half the size of adult males. So most of the time, depending on whether they're pregnant or they're running around with cubs and they're on their own, they'll be anywhere from a couple of 100 kilos up to about 450 kilos. Most common litter size is 2. Sometimes they'll have 3, as you can see here. Sometimes they'll have 1. And they're distributed throughout the circumpolar Arctic, but people often sort of, when you're sitting there with your martini going over the polar route in the plane and you look down and you see the Arctic's all ice, it looks like, well, there's a lot of habitat, right? Well, ice habitat is as different as terrestrial habitat. And if you got in a plane out in Minnesota, flew out to the west coast, you would look out the window and you would recognize all kinds of very different habitats. Well, the same applies in the Arctic and when you're talking about ice. And when you're looking here around the coastal areas and so on over the continental shelf, that's where the biological productivity is high. It's where we also have annual ice, and that's the ice that forms in the fall, is there for the winter, melts again in the summer. There's a lot of sunlight, biological productivity. Once you're out here in the central Arctic Ocean, there's lots of ice, all right, but it's very deep, and it's very biologically unproductive, and there are very few bears out there. We know now from a long series of mark and recapture studies and satellite tracking and so on, that we're currently recognizing 19 different subpopulations, of which probably somewhere in the vicinity of 2/3 of the bears in those populations are either in Canada or in populations like Alaska or Greenland, where they're shared with other jurisdictions. Now this is annual ice out in north of, very similar to what you would see in the north of the coast of Alaska. This is the flow edge, and this kind of habitat is really prime habitat for bears. The ice opens and closes as the wind blows offshore. It opens up the leads, it blows onshore, it closes them all up again. See, there's lots of seals out in here where it's easy to maintain breathing holes, or they don't have to. Then they move back into these stable ice areas. And there's a lot of ring seals out there. There's probably 7 or 8 million, or maybe even a few more ring seals spread all throughout the circumpolar Arctic. They're the main feed of polar bears. And as you can see from this one, they're relatively small. And that's handy from the perspective of a smaller or subadult bear, because it means small bears can kill them. And we'll get to some of the other things that bears eat. And you'll see that a lot of the prey species, a lot of the potential that's out there isn't available to a young bear. They're inexperienced, and they're just plain ordinary too small. Now, one thing we don't have a lot of in the polar basin anymore, but there used to be very abundant, there's still a little bit, and that's what we call multi-year ice. Come on in, find a seat. And this multi-year, that's ice that doesn't melt in the summertime. And it may get up to 25, 30 feet for Americans, 10, 15 meters, very thick, but it's very thick and it doesn't let much light through. It's very little biological productivity underneath, not many seals around. So when the bears like this female get on here with their cubs, they just walk right across it. They're not interested in spending time on there because the hunting really isn't very good. Now bears, the Latin name for polar bear is Ursus maritimus, or the marine bear, and that's because they've evolved to live in this polar maritime environment with sea ice. And they're very good swimmers, but they also have to be able to get around when the ice is not very thick. So they'll get down, they'll get down right onto their knees sometimes and go right across. They've got great big paws, which are very good for swimming. They also function a little bit like snowshoes, so that they can get out. And then, because sea ice, any of you have gone skating when the ice, or walking on the ice around a lake here when it's not quite frozen, knows that it shatters and you go right through. Well, sea ice isn't like that. It bends. And so you have a little bit of warning. And if you keep moving, I've seen people on skidoos, and years ago with the dog team, go right across ice that wouldn't hold you if you stood still, but you can see the bend in it when a person's going across it. Well, you can see that here. You can see this ice is bending and bending there, and the bear keeps on going, and it can get across just fine. Now, in some places, they can't do that because they want to cross a lead or get to some other area to hunt. They can't get there on the surface of the ice, so they dive down underneath and keep poking holes up like this and coming up and breathing, and you'll see this sort of thing. The first time I saw it, I thought, why are seals making a nice straight line like that? Obviously I wasn't what we're doing. But you do see, this is something that females will do with their very young cubs when they come out of their dens, because that water is really cold, and these cubs have virtually no fat or insulation, and if they have to swim very far, they just don't make it. And one of the things that we're seeing now in north of Alaska and a couple of other places, as the sea ice is getting farther and farther from the land, or wherever bears are having to go, they're having to swim much longer distances. And one of the undocumented levels of mortality that must be happening out there, because we know it to a small degree from radioed bears, is they're losing cubs when they go on long swims. But when they first come out of their dens, they'll do that. Now, energy is what makes the world turn around, whether you're talking about hydrocarbons or you're talking about a polar bear. So polar bears, the way that they organize their life is they take in as much fat as they can, as fast as they can, given an opportunity, and they'll spend those fat resources as slowly as they can. So they're not going to waste energy. So what this bear is doing, looks a little, why on earth is it bothering to do all that, which takes a fair amount of energy to jump off of a floe and then up on the other side. But in fact, in terms of the amount of energy it would require to get into the water, swim across, and then climb out, it's probably saving energy by doing that. They also don't really like to get wet if they don't have to. And I never really figured out that totally. This on the summer sea ice, the ice here is maybe a foot or two thick, or the water is a foot or two deep. But as you can see from this female, she's walked all the way around here and all the way around there, rather than just walk straight across. Some of that is, I think, probably related to energy conservation, and particularly for the cubs. And one of the most remarkable things about bears in general is their sense of smell. And I think polar bears certainly have a sense of smell that they absolutely depend on for finding seals. But also, as what this bear is doing, is looking for an adult female in the breeding season. And they'll walk along in the snow, and you can track them, and I've done this for 40 or 50 miles. And when they're looking for a female and they're going into wind, and they go straight across the sea ice, and you follow them, and they'll be crossing bear tracks all over the place, and they just keep plodding along. But the moment that they cross a trail of a female that's liable to come into estrus, and she's not in estrus at this stage, because we'll get to that in a minute. So but they're able to tell it'll be a female with 2-year-old cubs she's going to breed, or she'll be by herself, and they'll follow that track till they find the female, and then they'll try to herd them off into an area where they're less likely to run into competitive males, either into areas of very rough ice like this, sometimes into bays, sometimes up on a mountainside. And then for a period of a week or 10 days, the male will try and keep that female away from anybody else, and other males may come in and challenge them, and whoever's biggest wins out and continues on. And he keeps checking her with his nose, and she keeps running at him and swatting at him and being very rude. And she pretends to hunt here. Here she'll hunt for maybe 2 or 3 minutes instead of an hour. It's the polar bear version I always think of, you know, when you phone up a girl and she says she doesn't want to go out on a date because she's got to wash her hair. Well, this is basically what they're doing. They're just filling in time. And, but eventually, after a period of time, because they're induced ovulators, so all this behavior that goes on in the beginning is getting her ready so that, yes, she knows she can ovulate, and she's not going to waste that egg. It's not going to die. There's a male there that is going to mate. And once this starts, they'll go on for the next several days, and they'll mate and mate and mate. And it seems like that is the activity that's required to stimulate ovulation. That's how it all fits together. There's nothing, as far as I'm aware, that's actually been done experimentally on this, but it seems to be what is most likely the case. Well, then this takes place anywhere from late March to early May, but April is the most abundant month for mating. And then they have this period, and the ring seal pups, I'll keep coming back to this, but the ring seal pups are mostly born around the 1st of April. They spend about 6 weeks with their mother nursing and being weaned, and at that time they're about 50% fat and not very smart about predators, and that's the absolutely most important part of the year for polar bears to feed, is from about the middle of April until whenever breakup is. So keep that in mind. This is what you haven't really seen a fat bear until you've seen an ultra-fat polar bear female ready to go into her den. Now, this is back in the mid-'80s. We don't see these in Hudson Bay anymore. But this is back in the mid-'80s, and this bear we caught in the Churchill dump back in the days when the dump was active. Excuse me. We caught her, and she weighed about 200 kilos. And when we caught her, when she had yearling cubs with her, here she's gotten pregnant, weaned those cubs. She now weighs just under 500 kilos. And almost all of that is fat. So it's really quite remarkable. We couldn't put a radio on her neck because the neck was too big, so we glued one on the top of her head so we could find her den. And of course, so they go into dens, and in the Hudson Bay area, the pregnant females don't feed for about 8 months, which is a long time to go without eating. And they'll go into these snow dens, or in the Churchill area, they'll go into earth dens. Most of the rest of the Arctic, they go into snow dens early November. Young are born around Christmas time or December. And then they're nursed, and they're only a pound and a half when they're born. Their eyes are closed. And the females hold them up against their chest, and they nurse them inside this snow den, which is actually an artificial womb. It's not, because if those cubs are so poorly developed that if they were born outside, they would just die right away. So the The snow den functions as an artificial womb. The bear can nurse the young up till they're 25 or 30 pounds, and then away they go and they leave the den. As you can see, the scratch marks from the female opening up that den, and a couple of cubs in the background. But then she's getting pretty lean, as you can see on here. There's a lot of bones showing up and hips. It's time to go back out onto the sea ice. And that's when you start to learn about what polar bears really do. They're the supreme apex predator of the Arctic. They feed on a whole lot of different things. And I'll just comment in case anybody doesn't like the sound of, or the look of a bit of blood. There is some in a couple of pictures, and I apologize for that in one sense, but you have to remember that polar bears are predators. Like wolves and lions, part of the job description is killing things and eating them, so it's difficult to do without a bit of blood. So they are capable of killing a variety of different seals. They can take young and subadult walruses, but they have very thick heads. They're sort of like young human males. They're very thick-headed, and takes them a while to kill them because most of the other seals they can kill with a swat or a bite because a seal skull is really fairly brittle, not very strong. But walrus skulls are very, very thin. So they can kill the calves and the subadults, but they can't kill the adult males. They can also are capable of killing beluga whales and narwhals in the right circumstance, one of which is when you get these, what they're called sassats, or they're entrapments. And underneath the sea ice, there's a lot of Arctic cod, and they get further away from the edge of the ice the whales can get, the better their chance of being able to run into big schools of cod that haven't been preyed on for a while. So they get far away, and it's kind of a gamble. You get way in there and you feed and you get back out to the open water and you're okay. But sometimes if you get a bit too far in, you might get trapped. And you can see all of these scars here in terms on the top. In this entrapment, there were about 25 to 30 whales originally. Most of them were caught and killed by bears. What the bears do, these large adult males, is they jump on them, they whack them, they poke them, and as soon as they go down in breath, they can't get to another breathing hole. They come up, and before they've had a chance to breathe some more, they'll smack them some more. And I've seen them with literally the whole top of their head eaten right off. And so eventually they get tired. Bear gets a hold of the hind of the flukes. They drag them out. As I say, there were 20 to 25 belugas out on the ice, and there were another 30 or so polar bears feeding. It was a bonanza for subadults because they were too small to be able to catch these, but there was so much food that it didn't really matter. And this is the sort of real bonanza that a polar bear really wants to get into when they're out. This is a fin whale in Svalbard. And sometimes I've seen pictures with as many as 15 or 20 bears walking back and forth. People say, well, don't they fight? Well, polar bears, like a lot of predators, are very well armed. And you don't want to start a fight with someone who's really well armed unless there's a really good reason to do it. You're either both starving and there's only one morsel of food and it's small, or there's one breeding female and there's two males. So you'll get in a situation like this where there's all kinds of food. They'll literally be standing shoulder to shoulder, and they won't be fighting with each other. They'll just simply stick to eating. The other circumstance where you get large numbers of males together, sometimes literally shoulder to shoulder, is where there is absolutely nothing to compete for, like along the Hudson Bay coast in the fall, when they come ashore when the ice melts, and I'll go into that in a bit, but there's nothing to eat. They're just simply living on their fat. There's no point in wasting your energy or running the risk of injuring yourself by fighting with somebody for nothing, or seriously fighting. Bearded seals are the second most popular prey of polar bears, but they're big. They get up to 300 to 500 kilos, and they're up to 3 meters long, 2.5 meters. And so they're mostly killed by the adult males. But they're also well aware of the fact that there's polar bears around. Now, this looks kind of corny, but what actually is happening here, polar bears, like most bears, are really smart. And they've figured out what you have to do to hunt bearded seals in the largely open water season. And you see these little marks along here. Those those aren't just random marks. Those are his toe marks because he's lay down on the snow. He'd been pushing himself along with his hind feet to keep his profile down low. So the bearded seal looks around, he's not going to see an image of a bear. They get in the water like that, and now this seal is pretty safe. He's got very hard to get on a floe that small to catch a seal. So no matter what happens, that seal is probably okay. But as you can see over here, here's a seal hauled out, or a bearded seal hauled out on a floe, and here's a bear that's been stalking it in the water, and it's been going back and forth, keeping ice floes between it and the seal, so the seal can't see it. He's taken his last bearings here, figured out how far it is, where he has to go. He's dove down, he swam that whole distance under the water, suddenly exploded out of the water, and they are so powerful, they just come up, put their forepaws on the front of an ice floe, just like that, and they're right up and on the thing and on the go. And that seal there really didn't have that much of a chance. Now, this is the diet at the diet at the North Pole is very specialized, but it also sort of fits into a conference on bear and human conflict. But the real story of the evolution of polar bears into the Arctic marine habitat is the story of the relationship between polar bears and ringed seals. Now remember, they're small. They're only up to about this sort of length, and there's probably 7, 8, 9 million of them throughout the Arctic, or maybe not so many, quite as many now, but still lots. And one of the things that ringed seals don't do is lie around sleeping on the ice for long periods of time. They're always raising and lowering their heads. A seal that doesn't do that is going to be lunch. So here you have a seal looking around for polar bears. And here's a piece of what happens out there in that annual ice. I showed you the floe edge. But as the wind blows back and forth, it opens and closes these sorts of little leads. And they freeze over with this young ice. And of course, some seals will come and breathe in those leads. Then as they freeze over, there'll be a little hole. You can see there was a breathing hole here, and there's some blood on the ice. And that's very good hunting habitat for polar bears. Well, as the ice freezes more and gets thicker and thicker and more solid, and not much else is happening, the ringed seals, the adult ringed seals, live in the land-fast ice that goes completely solid. Bearded seals and younger ringed seals stay out in that moving ice, out in the floe edges and so on. But in these really solid, fast ice areas, and they have these great big claws on their foreflippers, and they scratch that ice all winter long. And each seal will maintain anywhere from 4 to 6 different breathing holes. Because if you only have one and a bear sitting beside it, you're in bad shape. Now, so that's what the holes look like when they're first starting to keep them open. And this is a schematic. Here's the ice starting to form in the fall, and there's cracks in it. Well, then the seals maintaining breathing holes as the ice gets thicker. And over these breathing holes, they're often around rough ice, little pressure ridges and so on, anything irregular that snowdrifts will form on. And then, so that come the spring, when the pregnant female comes up and she digs a little snow cave underneath these snowdrifts and gives birth to her pup, where it's sheltered, it's protected from the cold weather, and it's hidden from polar bears. And that's probably why the ringed seal of the Arctic is the smallest seal in the world of the ice-breeding seals, the smallest one. And probably why the reason it's probably stayed so small is that if it was any bigger, it wouldn't fit in those snowdrifts anymore. It could no longer live in that habitat. So they live in there, and here we have some of the last breathing holes being frozen up, and you can see that they're very popular with the bears. And here's this, when you fly over or you looked at this habitat, you'd think that's barren waste, there's nothing out there. This is really good seal habitat. And we're out there with an Inuk fellow that we worked with and a guy that I worked with for a long time, and looking for birth layers. And because inside those layers was this pup, which, as I say, was about 10 pounds when it was born, be about 25 pounds when it's weaned, and it's 50% fat and not too smart about predators. So after they're a week or so old, they're already accumulating quite a lot of fat, and they're of great interest to particularly female polar bears with their young cubs. Because the female bears with their cubs. They're always afraid of the males because the males are liable to kill the cubs. And so the hunting is actually a lot harder in these pupping areas than it is out by the flow edge. So there aren't quite so many males there. So the females, when their cubs are small, they hunt around, and you can see there's an interest all over here. You can see there's a couple of places where they've dug out a snow lair and haven't gotten anything. But what they do when they find one of these things, and with a dog that you'll see in a later slide, we went out and we surveyed a number of these areas, and we did some stuff, and we found that a trained Labrador retriever told to go and find birds and recognizes that a ring-sealed pup is just another thing you call a bird, and she could smell these seal lairs underneath this much drift snow from measured distances of about 2/3 of a mile, about a kilometer. It was absolutely incredible. Well, so obviously the bears can do that, and they're picking the circumstance because there are all kinds of different holes, breathing holes. One's used by adult males, one's used by females and cubs, and then they go and they find the one that they're going to hunt at. And then they stand. The first few times I saw this, they put their hind feet right up behind their front feet like that, and they look like a dog about to defecate. This is what I thought this bear was going to do the first time I saw it. It stood there and stood there and stood there, and I thought, well, it's really got a problem. And then eventually it reared up on its hind feet like that, smashed down into a den and lair and tried to catch something. That's how they hunt, and the reason they have their feet like that is the slightest bit of movement on that snow makes a noise through that is really loud underneath the ice, and no seal will surface there. And that's why early on, the Inuit hunters that had only a spear would stand on a piece of polar bear fur so their feet would stay warm, and they'd stand like that for hours and hours and hours over a breathing hole with a harpoon. And I've stood out on the ice when it's -40 a few times, and I simply can't imagine how those people did that. I have the most enormous respect for them. Anyway, she's teaching her young ones, and say they're sitting there behaving themselves. You get an idea of the size and depth of these holes. She's disappeared virtually into that seal's birth lair. Here's one that's been not too deep, and it's been dug out here, and the bear hasn't caught anything. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see down here that the bear did catch something and ate it. Now here's something that we see sometimes in years when seal productivity is really high. Don't see it all the time, but when seal productivity is really high, sometimes they'll kill a pup, but they won't eat it. See, this one's very young. It's got almost no fat on it. They've killed the pup, and they've been looking for the mother. Now, when you get back to the whole question of energy again, you can walk around, try looking for seals to stalk in the summer. You can walk around in the winter, but anywhere that you can lie down and wait for the energy to come to you is far more energy efficient. So you'll find that most of the hunting they do is lying down like that, but they will, in the summertime at least, do a certain amount of what we call aquatic stalking. They'll get down in these water channels in the ice and propel themselves along with their feet like that. That one looks like it's in deep water, but the water's only actually about that deep. As you can see from where we were with the telescope, you can see that her legs are way out here. When they do catch a seal, the part of the seal that they're most interested in eating, particularly in the wintertime, is just the fat and the skin. And part of that is because the fat is digested with an efficiency of about 95 to 96%. That means it's practically a straight pipe from the gut onto the bear. Very efficient. Also, protein requires a fair amount of water in the physiological process of digesting it. Where does water come from when it's 40 below? It comes from snow, which costs a lot of energy to melt. So in other words, it takes less energy to create the water you need biochemically from the fat you've got stored. So they do virtually no drinking when they're out in the wintertime. Now, people often say to me, and though a lot of people here would have anecdotes that could follow the next couple of pictures, people say, how smart are bears? And I always say, as most people here would agree, they're very smart. They think, they remember, and they're very good at problem solving. I think this one's takes a little bit of poetic license. It goes back to 1865, and allegedly from Inuit in Baffin Island told Hall that bears will get up on the top of a cliff and throw boulders down and on the walruses. Now, there's two versions of this. One is that it kills the walrus outright. The other is it stuns it and gives the bear enough time to go down and kill it himself. I wouldn't like to say there's anything that a polar bear doesn't do. Not really convinced this happened, but I wouldn't rule it out 100%. But I do know that this happened. And in this is a 5-year-old male in a zoo in Japan, and they were trying to keep it from developing stereotype behavior, and they didn't know what to do for a while, so they just hung up a piece of meat on a hook well out of where the bear could reach it. So the bear walked around, and after a little while, figured out that if it got its plastic toy, if it got its plastic toy and simply this is a piece of plastic, he learned to throw it, he then eventually got to be quite a good shot. He could just knock the meat off by throwing this toy up. Well, then he figured out, that's a lot of work. If I just go get a pole, I can knock it off. That's really a very interesting example of tool-using behavior, putting a bunch of steps together and carrying them out. And there are not very many animals that do that kind of thing. It gives you enormous respect for bears. Now, while Charlie was out in Hudson Bay trying to figure out how to catch polar bears and what was going on there in the first place, I was down in the Antarctic with ice-breeding seals. And Chuck was right. That was the background that gave me the background, and it set the stage for me mentally to be able to ask questions and do a lot of the things with seals in the Arctic that I don't think it would ever have occurred to me if I didn't have this background. But one of the things that impressed me initially and a long time ago was that here we are on about a nice sunny calm day. The seals are all lying out on the ice. Everything's fine. Erebus is puffing in the background. Nothing is happening. What's going on here? Is this just a stable environment? Well, I was very impressed with how variable things were between years in terms of ice conditions and whatever was going on with the pups. And I made a resolution to myself that at one time I got in a circumstance, I wanted to look at a polar marine system over a long, long period of time. And in the early days back in the Beaufort Sea, we found, don't worry too much about the details. Basically, this says that ring seal ovulation rates plummeted by about 50% in the mid-70s. The survival of pups plummeted by about 90%. These are big changes. You don't have to be trying to decide if you've got a 5% difference. Huge changes. And then they recovered, also apparently for natural reasons. And you can see that the polar bear productivity plummeted and then went back again. This convinced me that we really had to get into some of these things in a little bit more detail. So I went back to Hudson Bay in the late 70s. Chuck was down here in Missoula by that time. I went back to Hudson Bay in the late 70s and started some long-term work on a whole variety of things. But as any of you who are biologists know, you can't actually, especially in those days, you couldn't say you want to go out and study something for 20 or 30 years. That would be the end of it right then and there. So we had to link together a whole series of 2, 3, 4, 5-year studies without actually admitting to what the underlying one, which was to develop a whole baseline of what was going on with the biology and the ecology. And we went to Hudson Bay because it's annual ice. It all melts in the summertime. And because there's a counterclockwise current in the bay like this, and very strong winds, blows the last ice to melt. It's down here in the southwestern corner. We have a group of bears that come ashore here in Manitoba, another big group that come ashore here in Ontario. So we focused on these ones because we'd have all the bears of all age and sex classes in one relatively small area, because this work is really expensive, and one thing I didn't have a lot of was money. Now we'll jump ahead 30 years or 35 years. I want to make a really important point, especially if there's any managers in here, and that is that, I say that with respect, loving respect, and that is that when you want to monitor most things in an environment, you've got to do it for a long period of time. 5 years, according to most granting agencies, is a long-term study. 10 years is practically unheard of. But when you get to the kinds of things that we're really interested in here to do with climate change and Arctic marine systems, we're talking about 20 or 30 years. And some of the old hunters that I knew in the Beaufort Sea talked in those terms about things that they had seen. And so I'll just say here, there we have a 30-year data spread on the breakup date in Hudson Bay. And in a period of only 30 years, it is now a full 3 weeks earlier than it was only 30 years ago. That is just incredible in a period of time as short as one person's working lifetime. Now, but then look at, if you took any 10-year period in here, you would have no statistical relationship because there's so much variability between years, and we all know that just with the weather in our backyard in the wintertime. So keep in mind when you're looking at things that there's the long term when you see some of these other graphs. This is a very important one because we had satellite radios on a number of bears in a whole number of years. These are the dates of breakup down here. You can see a lot of variation between year. Doesn't matter what year, what time the ice breaks up, 3 weeks later the bears are ashore. And this is using satellite radios and looking at the areas that these bears with the radios we're looking at, not the whole area. Well, if you look then, if they're coming ashore earlier, they're feeding at that prime time for a shorter period of time. So if you look here, the ice is, if you're this going to the right on the graph, you're getting earlier and earlier. And the body condition gets better and better as you go this way. So you can see with males or females that the earlier the breakup gets, the poorer the body condition that those animals are in when they first come ashore. And every bear in Hudson Bay when it comes to shore, regardless of its age or sex, has to fast for a minimum of 4 months. No feeding. The pregnant female's got to last for 8 months. So how much time they have to feed at the very best time of the year is absolutely critical. So when they're losing now full 3 weeks compared to what they had before, that's really quite serious. And they're not getting out there. You can see that this seal here is pretty fat, and I'll show you another one. She's a straight pipe, turning all that fat onto here and putting out there as polar bear food. Another place you see that is the average weight of a lone female, suspected pregnant female, on the land in Hudson Bay in the fall, all coded to the same day. And you can see that back in 1980, we had the average weights were around 280, 290 kilos. Only 25 years later, we're down here to 230, 240 kilos. This red line, 189 kilos in the fall, is the lightest female that we ever caught that we know had cubs the following year. Any bears under that didn't have cubs. As you can see by the decline of the average weights down to here, another 20 or 30 years, and I don't think there's going to be very many cubs born in Hudson Bay if things continue the way they are at the moment. Another way of looking at the effective breakup date on polar bear demography, you have a late breakup here, say middle of July, 2/3 of the cubs in that particular year survived. The earliest breakup we have on record at the moment is the 1st of June, and only 1/3 of those cubs survived. The females just don't come ashore with enough fat to be able to keep those cubs alive into the following fall when they go back onto the sea ice. That has a number of other influences which starts to bring us to the purpose of this particular conference and workshop, interactions between bears and humans. When bears get skinny, they're running out of energy in the fall, they're not like a snowshoe hare or a caribou and they're starving to death. They're not going to lie down under a spruce tree or out behind a rock and starve to death. They're going to go looking for something else to eat. And in the most case, that's going to be villages, hunting camps, sometimes, unfortunately, humans. And you hear the Manitoba Conservation in Churchill has kept very good records for many years. And you can see here that there's been a steady increase, a lot of interannual variation again, a steady increase in the number of problem bears handled over the last 25, 30 years. And if you graph the number of bears handled against the breakup date, you find a significant relationship. In other words, earlier breakup, poorer condition, more problem bears in town. And that has a number of consequences. It used to be in Churchill that they then turned up in the dump. The dump has been closed. But up the coast along the, in Nunavut, along the coast, the Inuit villages right along the coast have garbage dumps, they have dead seals, they have polar bear carcasses, caribou carcasses, and they haven't started to develop, for the most part, they're just in the beginning of this. World Wildlife Fund has been helping them in the West Coast with things like electric fences and so on. But the whole business of patrols and cleanup, the kind of thing that you heard about taking place in Alaska, has yet to develop in most of northern Canada. This causes a certain number of concerns for users of places like national parks. This is an interesting way to wake up in the morning, possibly. You also see this sort of thing. This is a hunter who was camped in an area. The bear came in through the back of his tent, got a hold of him. This is the kindest, the nicest photo I can show you. Some of the others of him are really pretty rugged. In this case, they were armed. There's the bear there. A subadult male, skinny, is the classic problem polar bear, is a young subadult male. But it's not only only humans and human habitation that come under a greater amount of threat when bears get hungry, because the adult males go around and they'll kill young polar bears, cubs or subadults. This female, you can see she's not exactly fat, but she's standing up, and what she's looking for, she's watching very closely an adult male. When the adult males come around those family groups in the fall, we're starting to see, or have been for a while, seeing quite a bit of this. Here's a young cub. This male has killed the cub and simply eaten it. And we're starting to see this sort of thing even now in the late summer out in the pack ice in Svalbard. Here in the Beaufort Sea, this is in the early spring, when in a couple of years when bears were really lean. 3 adult females at least we found that were had been killed by adult males for food, and you can see just by the fact that there's virtually no fat between her skin and the bear that killed her was hungry enough to actually eat meat, which is very unusual in cold weather. So that bear was really hungry. Now here's the dog that can find these birth lairs in all sorts of places at great distances. And the next little bit gets back to the seals again, because you'll often see, well, if we have ice or we have then even if it freezes later or whatever, when the sun goes away, there'll be some ice and there'll be polar bears. And the assumption is just if the ice is there, the seals will be there and they'll be doing fine. But it's not necessarily true. This is what really good habitat looks like for ring seals. It's what it should look like in the spring. And here we are doing some of the work. This is a birth lair. There's a bug only got her leg in there in this one, but you can see that big thick layer of wind-blown snow. That's like concrete. You can jump up and down to that. A 1,000-pound adult male might have to smash 3 or 4 times to break through that. That's really high quality protection for a seal pup. And even when they're small, when they're very small, the mother will grab them by the neck, take them around to a nearby lair, or once they're a little bit fat, they can follow their mother there. Well, that's really high quality protection, and they need it. When you think of something like this, coming around and finding that birth lair and being ready to pound through, you really need that layer of snow to protect you. It gives you just a little bit more time if you're a seal. There's what's happening out there as the weather is getting warmer weather earlier in the spring. Here's a birth lair. You see the snow mostly around there hasn't totally melted, but there's heat coming up from the water, from the ocean, and there's warm weather in the sun. You see this seal, that's a very typically fat adult female seal. It's just a ball of fat. He wants to transfer that onto that skinny little fellow over there and then carry on and go and mate and do it all over again next year. This is a picture of a seal birth lair after an unseasonable rain. This was almost 30 years ago, at a time of the year when it should have been -20 or -30 centigrade. We got an unusually warm spell, pouring rain. The seal lair and this whole series of bays were all washed away. All of the pups were killed by Arctic foxes or bears. Some people have said to me, well, isn't that good? The bears got to eat lots of seals. Well, no, because the seals were only just born. They had no fat. They may have killed a lot of seals, but they didn't get much energetic benefit out of them. And another thing that we have only recorded once that I know about, but has got to be happening out there more often, and will happen more in the future, and that's the collapse of dens that polar bear mothers and their cubs are actually in. This is out on the northern Yukon coast, between just east of the Alaskan border. And this female was in a den from the size and age of her cubs sometime around early February. That den collapsed. It was a very warm period. I don't know if it rained or not. I have talked to every hunter I can talk to all along that coast. Nobody was traveling there at the time. We do know the temperature went up several degrees above freezing. I think it's possible that it rained. Whether it did or not, for sure I don't know. But what I do know is that the roof collapsed. It was heavy. That bear couldn't move, and she died there. And I think that is one thing that we're going to see more and more of. Or we may not see it, but I think it's going to occur. And it's very serious because what happens to those pregnant females is what determines the direction that any bear population goes. So to go back then to the theme of this meeting, what are we looking at with climate warming and polar bears and polar bear ecology? This graph is one that you may have seen in the newspapers and so on. This is in September every year is when you have the minimum amount of ice that's left in the polar ocean but at the end of the summer before it starts to freeze again. And this data series goes back to 1979 because that's the first year that we had satellite coverage of the entire Arctic. And you can see that, again, lots of interannual variation, but if you're going from 1979 to 2011, we're losing about 10% of that ice a decade. That is a huge rate. We've lost something like 70 or 80% of the multi-year ice out there. If you look at, this is what the average ice was, and it was 2000, the ice minimum. And that's already moved back quite a bit because the ice minimum used to be over here in Alaska a lot closer to the coast. But this is what's projected for 2040. I'll just go back to here. And that's what's projected. But the thing that's come out of the most recent analyses of ice studies is that if you actually use the satellite data, we're losing ice much more quickly than any of the models project that we are. There's about 10 models. There's also what they call the average one that uses the average of the models that best predict what's happening in the Arctic. And in fact, we're losing ice faster than that if you look any of the models, if you look at what's actually happening. I'll just take you back to there to there. Now, that's in 30 years. Your kids and your grandkids may or may not see anything, much of what we've just been looking at pictures of, depending on what all of our societies and we throughout the world, we can't do it on our own. We literally have to have everybody in the world. It's one of the things that Polar Bears International is very good at. If you teach kids or you're in schools or whatever, polarbears.org has programs on there in PowerPoint, whatever that teachers can take. They're free, all that kind of stuff. It's very good to do. So what we're going to see is because we're losing this ice, bears are going to be doing a lot more fasting. Now we know that in Hudson Bay, places like East Baffin, Hudson Bay, Greenland, the ice moves right away and the bears all come right on shore. But the same sort of thing happens in places like Alaska because those bears traditionally would have gone north into the multi-year pack ice way over that deep Arctic basin, and they'd be out on the ice, but they wouldn't be catching very many seals because it's not very productive out there. But they would be fasting too. So you have a fasting period. What's happening to this because of climate warming is that the fasting period is getting longer. As that fasting period gets longer and longer, bears are using up more and more of their stored resources just to trying to make it back to when they can feed again on a regular basis. One of Andy DeRoche's PhD students, a very mathematical ecologist, built a model that projected, this is only a model, so it may be off by 5, 10, 15%, but the principle is there. Right at the moment, we're looking at about 140 to 150 days of open water in Hudson Bay. And we know we're finding and documenting bears that are starving to death in Hudson Bay now. Occasional adults, some cubs, we know it's happening. We're down here at this sort of level, 140, 150 days. You saw how much variability there was between years. If we suddenly jump up to 160 days or 170 days, we're going to have literally hundreds of bears that are very, very hungry. Tens or maybe in the low hundreds are going to starve to death. What are they going to do before they starve to death? They're going to look for something else to eat. And we're going to see, we project when it's going to happen. It might not be for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but I think we can say fairly surely that in the lower Hudson Bay, in Manitoba, Ontario, and that section of the Nunavut coast, we are going to see in our lifetime a very large, 1-year big problem with starving bears. And that's going to result in a great amount of mortality of problem bears. There's already about 50 polar bears being killed as problem bears in the Canadian North. Not all of it was recorded that way because some of them get shot and they're recorded as just in the normal quota and so on. But it's happening in a lot of places already, and especially up the Nunavut coast. Now here's something just as a last sort of thing. This is also in real time. This isn't a model. In this area of eastern Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, and most of the Davis Strait, which is a very big population of bears, about 2,400 bears in here. The ice didn't freeze over here at the 31st of December. It was still all open water. All those bears that live in this area here were all still standing around on shore waiting for something to eat. I don't know what they did because it's not really very well documented and people don't travel much at that time of the year. It's dark. It's stormy, and there's bears out there, so people don't travel along the land. Exactly what happened, we don't really know, but we do know that this has actually happened in eastern Hudson Bay and part of Davis Strait 2 years in a row. If we got that same thing happening on this side of Hudson Bay, we would really know about it because people are living all along here, and we would be seeing them. So we know for sure that we have major climate problems in western Hudson Bay and southern Hudson Bay. We know in the southern Beaufort Sea. We're projecting that in some of these areas here, we're not going to be long from now before we do have a number of problems. Very likely, some of these situations exist up in these other islands. We don't have good enough data to say yes or no. We also know that some of these populations in here, where the ice does last, are in perfectly fine shape. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are populations of polar bears that are in trouble right now. There are some that are doing fine. And quite likely, for a while, up here in the most northerly area of the Canadian Arctic Islands and Greenland is the last place that the ice was probably will remain. If we can get climate warming under control in the next 20 to 30 years, we can probably keep some number of bears and hopefully enough of the natural ecosystem in that part of the world. If we don't, we're in trouble. 20 or 30 years, we probably will have very little in lower Hudson Bay. I think that area is probably very close to being written off on the long term. So I think it's time for the world as a whole, and I'm not talking now just about polar bears, but the whole of the Arctic marine system and a lot of other parts of both the polar regions and elsewhere in the world where climate warming is real. I don't think there's any question about that. We know what the major problem is. We've seen the enemy, and it's us. And so we have to decide if we want this sort of thing, or if we want polar bears to wander off into the distance and their tracks to eventually disappear. Thanks very much. I finished one slide too early, I'm sorry, and I apologize to everybody on here because none of us do these things on our own. Like I'm not the Lone Ranger. I had a lot of very, very good people to work with over the years, colleagues, graduate students, a number of organizations that funded me long-term, various people and organizations for short-term, too many to list. I thank them all. It wouldn't have happened without them. So thanks very much again.
Dr. Stirling will answer questions for about 10 minutes or so. Anybody that has to leave, go ahead and leave. There's some signed copies of his book available outside right now, and he'll be out there when the next 10 minutes of questions are finished. So, anybody have any questions?
What is the estimate society?
The question,
Question, sir.
yeah, routine, thanks. The question was, what can we in society do about this? I think there's a number of different levels. Obviously, as individuals, we try to reduce our carbon footprint to the degree we can, and probably not very many of us are down anywhere near where we eventually may need to get to be. I think that we can support organizations like Polar Bears International, World Wildlife Fund, and a variety of other agencies that are doing what they can. But basically, we're looking at large-scale industry, not only in North America, but in other parts of the world. And in particular, the burning of fossil fuels and coal in particular. And somehow we have to galvanize our politicians, and we in Canada are, I think, leaving a lot to be desired in that respect. We talk a good game, but we don't do it to the degree that we should be. You've got some problems down here with various people who don't seem to believe that climate change is occurring or that humans are involved. I think we have to be as active as we possibly can with pressuring our own elected people, because one of the things we really know is that if someone thinks they're not going to get elected unless they say or do what the majority want done, that's what they're going to do. If they think you won't vote for them, they'll, as we've seen in any kind of election, people will chop and change their positions to try and make it relate to whatever focus group. So I think that's the biggest thing that we can do. I have to admit that to some degree, some days I'm not that optimistic. That's why I dedicated my book to my grandchildren, in the hope that maybe some of what I've been lucky enough to enjoy most of my life might still be there when they're old enough to appreciate it. I don't have a simple answer. I wish I did. I guess if it was easy, maybe we would have fixed it. At the back?
Yeah. Have you seen much interspecies aggression or breeding? I know that there was a polar bear, coastal grizzly, mixed kills last year.
Question was, have we seen very much interbreeding or mixing with polar bears and presumably brown bears? No, we haven't, not very much. There are two documented cases, both in the southern Beaufort Sea, not too far from east of Alaska. In both cases, it's the male is a brown bear, a grizzly, and the female is a polar bear. And that's probably because the males come out of their dens earlier, and there's dens right along the coast grizzly bear dens on land right along the coast in that area. The males come out earlier, and there's not much to eat. And so they can smell dead seals and things out on the ice, and they start going out on the ice and scavenging on seals that have been killed by polar bears. Some of my Inuit friends tell me that they've actually seen brown bears hunting seals, and I have no doubt that that's happened. I haven't actually seen it myself. So it's the polar bear males that are out there, and I think the females are probably pretty young, and maybe they're not that experienced, and the pattern of behavior and the herding and the interacting for a long period of time before they mate is characteristic of brown bears as well, and they're very closely related. Because when they do mate, and there have been lots of matings and back crosses and everything else in zoos, not quite sure why the zoo community seems to like to do this sort of thing, but in Europe anyway, for at one stage, they were interbreeding everything. And one of the things that turns out is that the offspring are fertile. And in the second hybrid that we had in the Canadian Arctic, the mother was a hybrid. Her father was a brown bear, and her mother was a polar bear. And she mated with a grizzly bear and produced this second generation hybrid. We also know from the fossil evidence and fossil DNA, ancient DNA, that some 20 or 30,000 years, I don't remember the exact period, during one of the warming periods, there was some interbreeding between polar bears and grizzly bears in Northern Ireland. And that in some stocks, there's some research active and going on at the moment. I don't know where they're at, but I do know that in some polar bear populations, they have detected the existence of some brown bear genes. How many, I don't know, but so it has happened. The question that I then often answer is that a hope for saving polar bears, or will they just all interbreed? Probably not. Remember that polar bears evolved from grizzly bears. They took probably 15 or 20,000 years to become polar bears. They did that 150,000 years ago. they're not going to evolve back in 100 years or 4 or 5 generations. And the food wasn't there anyway. The reason that polar bears are big is because they're highly specialized to feed on a very large and very nutritious food base. That's seals. That's why you have the biggest grizzly bears in Alaska, as everybody knows, because they've got the salmon streams to feed on. The smallest grizzly bears in the world are along the Arctic coast where these hybridizations have been taking place, because there is virtually nothing to eat up there. Yeah, you?
Yeah, with the polar bears that are removed or killed in conflict situations, you have to mention maybe 50 or so a year. Is data, do you know if good data is being documented on the body conditions of those animals to know whether food stress is associated with driving them?
The question is body condition routinely recorded from polar bears that are killed as problems? The answer is no. I wish it was. It is recorded in some cases, so we have some indication that these bears, in fact, quite a few of them are not in very good condition, not well recorded just generally at that part of the world. We're working on trying to improve it, and one of the things, you're welcome to take one if you want, there's some little charts out there on the desk which show what the condition of a bear would be if you called it anywhere from condition 1 to 5. And that's a very robust sort of a scale. We're trying to get people to use that. But right at the moment, there's a ways to go on that sort of thing. A hand over here, someone?
Yeah, assuming you can get them adjusted, would polar bears survive in the Antarctic?
Oh, I hate that question. The question, would polar bears survive in the Antarctic? I mean, you've been reading too many Larson cartoons. Well, there is some interesting side. They probably do all too well, and I don't think the penguins would really like it very much. Fortunately, it hasn't happened. There is a sort of an urban myth around that in the late 40s and late 40s and mid 50s, when the U.S. was just starting to get going in some of the Antarctic stuff, and Byrd was down there, and then they're going to start McMurdo. And they used to bring the icebreakers down. They still do. They were all Coast Guard in those days. They'd be in Alaska in the summer and then the Antarctic. And there was a rumor around for a while that some icebreaker captain wanted to catch 2 or 3 bears and let them go down there. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. One of the things that does intrigue me, though, is this is a question, it's an experiment I'm not interested in supporting, but when polar, depending on where the bears came from, most bears, when they're going to wherever they spend the summer or fast, they go a particular direction. It's something they've learned from their mothers. They learn all these things they need to know in the 2.5 years they spend with their mother before they're weaned. And so if you took some bears from Alaska that would normally go north a few hundred miles into the ocean and spend the summer out in that pack ice, if they were in the Antarctic, would they go north again and out into the open ocean? I don't know. Probably not, but you never know. Anyway, they would probably do fine, but I hope nobody ever gets that idea.
Hi, yeah, I know there's been some behavioral plasticity in polar bear feeding. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I've been around too many guns and helicopters. My ears aren't as good as they used to be. Pardon me?
I was just saying, I know there's been some behavioral plasticity of feeding eggs and birds and such by polar bears. And I work in nutrition, and so just realizing the body size of the polar bear, I don't believe that alternative food sources will allow polar bears.
Front of the class. The question was, yeah, sure. The comment was that she has read about bears eating various alternate food things. Goose eggs is one of the latest ones you hear about. Berries, little fish about this long, a variety of things. Most of that sort of thing is done by subadults. The ones that haven't figured out that you got to just be sort of like subadult males, you know, of humans, are the ones that you can't tell anything to. And they're going out there and they're feeding on these alternate things if they happen to be handy. But the comment that she had as a nutritionist is she could have a hard time imagining how an animal as big as a polar bear is going to live on those kinds of things. And the very short answer is they can't. There simply isn't enough energy. Now, if 3 or 4 polar bears get into a snow goose nesting colony and there's maybe 40,000 snow goose eggs, well, they might be okay for them for a short period of time, but it's not going to help the population very much. But the flip side of that is that polar bear predation on snow geese, eiders that nest in in some of these little isolated islands, and even things like black guillemots, which nest on cliffs. The bears are getting hungry enough to go and eat the eggs. So it's probably not doing them a lot of good. It's doing some of the bird colonies a great deal of harm.
There's a lot of icebreakers going on where oil is being developed on the Russian coast. And I believe there's also some more, I guess, in Canada, and also that there's the leaves opening up further and further. Can you talk a little bit about how that will probably impact at least human bear comfort?
The question, or the comment in question was that, that icebreakers are going along the Arctic coast of Russia and the Arctic coast of Canada in various places. They're breaking ice, so they'll be aimed at offshore exploration and drilling and year-round shipping and so on. And what's the effect of that on polar bears? The short answer is that nobody can really answer that in a quantitative fashion. We can speculate about a number of things. I know from some work I did on offshore drilling rigs a number of years ago, and anybody who's watched bears in general knows how curious they are. And if you're out on the sea ice and or you're watching polar bears or you're tracking them, you can see that if there's a rock or a fuel drum or a little island, anything that contrasts with the horizon, they're going to go and check it out. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that little islands, when the tide is making the ice go up and down twice a day, there's cracks around the edges, and there's always higher numbers of seals, and they're maintaining breathing holes. So those are good things to go and check out for breathing holes. In the offshore islands and offshore drilling rigs that were in the Beaufort Sea back in the 80s, they were there all winter. The ice doesn't just sit still like it does in a lake. It's moving all the time. And so it's going by, and there's always a little wake behind it. And so seals soon figured that out. The seals are breathing there, so the bears are coming in, and they're actually concentrating around these rigs that are out there in the ice because the seal hunting is better. So if you start getting incidental spills of a relatively small amount of oil in that sort of situation, it could be fairly harmful to a small number of animals. It's quite likely that the occasional icebreaker that goes through a particular area opens up a lead for a while. If it's open or closed for a few days, whatever, that might create a situation which might be beneficial to polar bears hunting for a short period of time. But I think we're looking at an iron ore mine in northern Fox Basin in Canada, that's north of Hudson Bay. There'd probably be something like 600 ship passages a year in and out of there. Now, a good proportion of those are going to be during ice-covered times, and what that is like is probably going to eventually result in a certain amount of mortality of bears, walruses, and possibly entrapment of whales. To some extent, we're not going to know the real answer to these sorts of things until they happen. But it's going to be very important that we have monitors and scientists or whatever and local people involved with the monitoring so we know what really does happen.
What is the expected impact on the seal populations as the ice dramatically reduces in scope?
The effect on
The seal population.
Oh, the question was, what is liable to be the effect on seal populations if we lose the ice? I think it'll be devastating for ring seals. That's what I was trying to show you a little bit about with the changes in the warmer weather and the collapsing of birth layers and washing out of them in the springtime is going to result in very high mortality. Later on, if those areas are breaking out before the pups have actually weaned, we do have some good documentation from some of the long-term, again, 20, 30-year studies done in the Beaufort Sea. We know that if you get a really early breakup before the pups are actually weaned, and they get separated from their mothers, fair numbers of them do, and they start getting in the water too much, and they start using their energy to try and keep warm instead of using their energy to get rid of that white lanugo coat, it's called, and get their hair, and they end up simply running out of energy and dying. So I think In terms of ring seals, we know that small numbers can continue to exist in places like the Baltic Sea, where there are no predators to speak of anymore other than red foxes. All of the bears and wolves and so on from the Baltic are pretty well gone. But bearded seals are also ice dependent. They may use the land a little bit. To some degree, that niche will be replaced to start seeing harp seals and maybe harbor seals. But the bulk of the ring seals, that is the most important single species, isn't going to be replaced by anything else, I don't think. Jack?
Thanks, Dr. Sterling. Appreciate your presentation.
Ian is my name, Jack. You know that.
I was just curious, how did some of these successful bear deterrence programs get started? Were they sort of early projects of you and your colleagues? Was it policymakers that sort of built on your foundations? Or had it become its own discourse by then and some of these ideas were put into practice?
I think what you're asking me is how were we able to do this stuff for a while?
Well, I'm just kind of curious as to how the bridge was made between the hard scientists and the policymakers to sort of come up with these ideas of human bear deterrence.
Well, I can only make a couple. The question was, how did the connection be made between doing some of the science in the first place and then translating it into policy and so on? For a long time in Canada, and I think in the US, we had single organizations. In Canada, it was the Canadian Wildlife Service, and in the US, it was US Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the managers, senior people somewhere along the line decided that, that they needed a group that just did research and just a group that just did management. So instead of the managers and the scientists being across the corridor from each other, now they're in different buildings, different towns, goodness knows what happens. And as soon as you split any group, you have us and them. So when I first started, for a long time, we were a research organization. The manager, we were in a culture where managers, both provincially, federally, and then territories, wanted the information. They wanted to use it in the management. We had a management system that made that work really well. Within our own organization, we also had a generation of managers. I don't know how to put this diplomatically, because I really valued it. Some of the managers really weren't great managers, but they kind of knew it. And so they got out of your hair. The guy that gave me used to introduce himself as the guy that let me get out of control. And basically what he did is says, you do your job. As long as you're doing what you're supposed to be doing for the agency, you can do anything else you want if you can find money to do it. So I said, fine. And that's why I got such a long relationship with the University of Alberta, because I ran a whole graduate program through that for 30 years. And so we had a generation of managers who let us do a lot of things if we could find the money for it. We had a generation of managers who wanted to use that right away. We've now split into two different organizations, in Canada anyway, and I have the sense that that's happened in Alaska as well with polar bears, but that's not for other people to comment on. And so I think, to make a long story short, Jack, I think it's a lot harder than it used to be. And while you were involved in the workshop, we were a bunch of us from around the circumpolar nations were trying to design an international monitoring program for polar bears, and I think we did a pretty good job. But once it got to the Arctic Council, it was supported by Russia, was supported by Norway, and the three countries that had Aboriginal hunters and maybe a lot of politics and a lot of offshore activity, Greenland, Canada, and the United States, would not support it. So we're currently trying to see where we can go with some of that on a lower scale. So things change, but it's been my experience over the years that things either work or don't work because of individuals. It doesn't really matter what policy and all the rest of it amounts to. Someone wants to make something happen, they can make it happen. If someone wants to stop it, they can usually stop it.
Two more questions.
Yeah, okay.
No. I see Chuck had a.
Yeah, I'd like to
know what you think about it. What I think might happen is that oil and gas drilling by the U.S. and Russians and shipping through the Northwest Passage might ruin all that ice and ruin the polar bears before global melting ruins them.
His comment is they think that maybe the offshore activity in Russia and Alaska and probably Canada and the shipping will do in the ice ahead of the global climate warming. I think that in a lot of places at least from what I've seen from icebreakers I've worked on and places I've worked in that sort of circumstances, that what a lot of icebreaker activity can have an impact in localized areas which may be very important by causing freeze up to be later or break up to be earlier, but on a pan-Arctic basis, though it may change the ice structure and it may change breakup patterns, but I don't think those activities on their own will influence the long-term trend in the melting or freezing of the ice. But that's not to say that they couldn't have quite significant effects in critical areas.
Let's have one more question.
Thank you again for your wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask, is there any research on harmful effects from telazol on humans and bears?
The question, it's quite a good one from Andy. It's from Barrow in Alaska. One of the questions that indigenous people ask us all the time is what is the effect of the drugs that we use on bears, and also what's the effect of us handling the bears. I'll take it in two stages. The drug that we use now is called telazol. We've used in a variety of different ones, but pretty well everybody in the polar bear world anyway uses telazol. And because so many people in Canada, so many Inuit in Canada eat polar bears, the Health Canada funded a fairly expensive study in which some bears were actually sacrificed. They were drugged in the normal way. They were sacrificed at periods of time after drugging, and their blood and their body tissues and their meat and so on were analyzed to see how long the drugs themselves and their metabolites lasted in the system and when would it be safe to eat bears. Well, first they said they were really conservative, and they said, oh, shouldn't eat them for a year. So if somebody shot a polar bear that had been tagged within a year, then they were paid compensation for that for food. Now we know, and there's been looked at much more. In reality, it probably wouldn't matter if you ate them within a couple of hours, because you'd have to eat so much of the animal that you probably couldn't do it. But I think the current recommendation is not to eat for about a week. Do you know, Dean?
No, I can't remember the changes since.
It's short. It used to be a year. And I think it's a week.
Yeah, it's
16 days.
16 days. Okay. Anyway, it's not very long. And the other question, other part of that was what's the effect of us handling bears? We've looked at this in many, many different ways, and we do know, for example, that if a bear has been caught by a helicopter and here's a helicopter coming, it will run. And the most important thing is, does handling affect their survival? No, it doesn't. At least we've never been able to detect it in many different studies looking for that specifically. Does it affect their reproductive rate or the survival of their cubs? No, it doesn't. So, good question. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stirling.